Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Bad Gays, a podcast about evil and complicated queer people in history. My name is Ben Miller. I am a writer and historian, and today we have a special guest. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Liz Rosenfeld, an artist, writer, and I guess a sort of nerdy researcher of sorts.
Liz and I share many interests, but one of them is the American musical theater. And with Hugh safely out of the building in London doing his work, we can finally queen out a little bit. So today's episode is best explained by a little radio drama that Liz has written for us. And Liz is now going to give us the setting.
I should say this is a collaborative role play written between me and ChatGPT.
Oh, amazing.
Mm-hmm. Picture it. A lavish Hamptons estate belonging to Arthur Lorenz, who was a prominent playwright, librettist, screenwriter, and director, famous for writing Broadway sensations such as West Side Story and Gypsy, amongst others. A sophisticated yet uninhibited orgy of during the golden age of Broadway is taking place. It is the 1950s, and writers, actors, musicians, basically the closeted and fabulous homosexual stars of the stage and screen, are present and getting down and dirty on a bearskin rug situated in the middle of a Bauhaus-style meets New England beach home. The atmosphere is relaxed, with music, laughter, and an air of carefree indulgence. Stephen Sondheim and Jerome Robbins find a quiet corner to catch up. Each holding a drink, Stephen is in slacks and a casual button-down, open maybe one button more than usual, exposing a little tuft of chest hair. He's definitely the one with the most clothes on at the party. Jerry, on the other hand, is sporting a pair of pristine tighty-whities, a white undershirt, and black socks that end halfway up his calves. Stephen Sondheim, looking around with a bemused smile, says, "Well, Jerome, this isn't exactly where I expected to catch up with you. The venues for industry parties seem to be getting more imaginative. Arthur certainly knows how to throw a party, doesn't he? A little more intimate than our usual Broadway bashes."
And I'm Jerome Robbins. Well, intimate's one way to put it. You have to hand it to him. Arthur's always been bold. No kidding. Who knew that stepping into a different kind of drama would be on tonight's agenda?
Quite the deviation from our usual script meetings and theater gatherings. Though it does bring a new meaning to breaking the fourth wall, doesn't it? I suppose if anyone could host a party with a flair for the dramatic, it's Arthur.
Or perhaps the fifth wall, considering the circumstances. But you know, Artie has never been one for half measures, that's for sure. It's fascinating how our worlds intersect in so many ways, on stage and off. We all share this understanding of performance, even in the most unconventional settings.
Indeed. It's almost like a live performance art piece, though I must say the blocking is rather unconventional. There's a certain artistry to everything here. The choreography is, shall we say, improvised, but there's a kind of beauty in that spontaneity. That must make you very uncomfortable, Jerry. I mean, you're a perfectionist after all. Wink, wink.
I was just thinking the same. If only we could capture this sort of raw, unfiltered energy for the stage. Though I'm not sure Broadway audiences are quite ready for this kind of experimental theater. You can't choreograph this kind of raw desire, though God knows I try to bring it out of every dancer that dares to stand on my stage.
I think it's safe to say that choreographing this would be quite the challenge, even for you, Jerry. I can only imagine the rehearsal notes.
Ha ha! Well, I've always said that good choreography can tell any story. Not for the faint of heart, maybe that would be the title. But honestly, there's something refreshing about the lack of pretense here. It's pure expression without the usual trappings of our work.
No script, no set design, just a different form of storytelling. In a way, it's a reminder of the core of our craft, connecting with emotions, with humanity in its most stripped-down form. Meanwhile, I'm fascinated by the, let's say, improvised lyrics around us. Not quite the finesse we're used to crafting, but certainly heartfelt.
Exactly. It's almost like an unscripted play where everyone's a protagonist in their own narrative. Quite a study in character, wouldn't you say? A different kind of rhythm and cadence, for sure, though some of these lines might not make it past the censors.
A character study indeed. Art imitates life, after all, even in the most unexpected places. And who knows, maybe there's inspiration to be found here for our next big project. Isn't pushing boundaries what we've always done?
Possibly. Though I think any attempt to capture this particular audience on Broadway might be a bit too ahead of its time. But Artie's always been good at creating spaces where people feel free to be themselves. It's part of his charm, and it's why his work resonates so deeply.
That and his unapologetic honesty on and off stage, we could all use a bit of that boldness in our lives, don't you think?
Absolutely. Here's to Arthur, then, and the unfiltered expression of life. Maybe I'll be as brave. For now I say we enjoy the show in all its unscripted glory. Cheers, Stephen, to unexpected experiences.
Cheers to that, Jerry, and to unexpected inspirations wherever they may come from tonight. And do let me know if you need a hand out there later. I'm always here to assist your choreographic visions. Wink, wink.
So I am now devastated by the fact that there was never a Stephen Sondheim / Jerome Robbins Dark Room, the musical.
I mean, one could argue that kind of in the subtext of the musicals that they both choreographed and wrote, there actually was.
Into the Mineshaft?
Into the Mineshaft. Company could
With
be.
With one changed letter.
It's true. So, the figure that I wanted to so desperately find some kind of bad gay dirt on was Stephen Sondheim. But it turns out he was just actually a really good person.
I hate it when that happens.
I know, it's really disappointing because there's something about wanting to find sort of deep, distressing, evil facts about somebody, like a figure that you just deeply have loved your whole life.
Oh, believe me, I know.
Yeah, just because it makes it more exciting and seductive. But I am going to start with Stephen Sondheim as a figure to lead us into Jerome Robbins, since they both worked on, as you will find out, some of the most iconic and groundbreaking shows on Broadway.
I'm excited to find out more about their biographies and also about why Jerome Robbins was bad. Because I have to say, I always kind of liked Jerome Robbins' work. I mean, despite being traumatized by being cast in my high school's production of West Side Story as an unnamed jet with no speaking roles, who my high school decided to name Mouthpiece. Despite the trauma of having to be the world's least ungrateful 13-year-old doing those West Side Story jump kick things with the arms in the front, I used to live in New York, and I remember going to see Jerome Robbins stuff at the New York City Ballet, and I always thought it was kind of wonderful, beautiful dance. And
he really was a visionary and the revolutionary in musical theater. Early 40s to late 50s was considered to be the golden age of Broadway because Broadway shows shifted deeply from simplistic, surface entertainment into the existential human condition.
We go from chorus girls in satin bloomers of 1932 ! To
exactly.
Something like Carousel, which is a fun, uplifting family musical about spousal abuse and how sometimes that's okay.
Exactly.
Very bad show, very beautiful show, very evil show in many ways.
And this was very much on the back of post-World War II Communist Party politics, which we'll also touch on later, which many artists in the 30s joined the Communist Party in the US because it was standing for labor rights and anti-racism, and you will find out later that all blew up in their face. So, as I said, I wanted this Bad Gays episode to be about Stephen Sondheim because I love him, and who doesn't like to look at the darker sides of the artists we've always loved up until our entire lives. I grew up in New York City, Manhattan to be specific. I was luckily brought up by two people whose leisure and pleasure was all around culture. And to be more specific, one of the staples in my house was a barrage of Broadway musicals, but his musicals became really the center of many conversations about the state of the arts, the human condition, and politics, as that's what he was also trying to unpack his complicated relationship to all of that. And Saturday and Sunday afternoons in our home were often listening to original productions that my dad in particular had a huge record collection of. And we would sing along. And speaking of my dad, he literally is the straightest musical theater queen I've ever met. His name is also Steven Rosenfeld, who's now 81, and who saw his first Broadway musical at the age of 8 in 1952. And since then, he has kept a diary of each musical and non-musical theater work he's seen. He writes 2 lines, notes on the production, as in the director, the choreographer, etc., and a 1-line review of whether he liked it or not.
What an amazing document.
I know.
I'd love to see that. I mean, imagine the things he must have seen.
Oh my God. I mean, he's seen the original production of Peter Pan, The King and I, all of it. Like West Side Story. I mean, he was there.
Along with a few other things, like kind of certain kinds of sexual experimentation in homosocial environments, I feel like open male homosexuality also kind of destroyed the straight musical theater queen. I mean, I think there always probably was a disproportionate number of gay men among the men who were creators of and interested in any kind of lyric theater. You know, it for various reasons that people like Wayne Kestenbaum have written about, but there, you know, this is a time when your dad grew up where there'd be movies about, like, the movie White Christmas is the straightest movie ever.
Yes.
And the movie is about how Danny Kaye and Bing Crosby are 2 World War II buddies who decided to sing and dance their way to stardom. Back then, that was like normal adult male heterosexuality in some way.
Absolutely. And I also think it's important to note that the American musical theater was absolutely a product of wartime. It was wartime entertainment that then continued on and became a product. People like Sondheim, like Lorenz, like Robbins really brought their love and craft and investment in the human condition to this genre in a way that nobody had seen before.
It's really a moment like, the only other moment I can think of like it in terms of the relationship between the economic means of production and the artistic quality that happens almost in despite of that is late 19th century Italian opera.
Oh, yeah.
Which that's the only time that opera has ever made money. And yet these are enduring artistic works. I mean, some of the plots are pretty silly, but also some of the musical plots are pretty silly.
Totally.
But this is like just in terms of a commercial theater that then manages to produce, or Shakespeare is another example, right? A commercial theater that then manages to produce work, often not the work that is the most commercially successful at the time, but that has a lifespan and that has something to say to many different generations.
Understanding Sondheim is absolutely a bridge to understanding Robbins and the time in which they were working, particularly because they were both first-generation Jewish gay men in their fields. Just a quick early life background on Sondheim. He was born in 1930 into a Jewish family who lived on the Upper West Side of New York City. They had a dress manufacturing company where his father, Hubert, manufactured dresses designed by his mother, Foxy.
Foxy Sondheim?
Yep.
Oh my God.
I mean, that was her nickname, but that's how Stephen talked about her.
I'm imagining long cigarette holder, fur coats, lots of eyeliner.
And like red long nails.
Perfect.
His parents divorced when he was a kid, which left him feeling very neglected and angry. In particular, Sondheim detested his mother, Foxy, who was said to be psychologically abusive and to have projected her anger from her failed marriage onto her son.
Wait, are you telling me that a gay Jewish man has a complicated relationship with his mother?
Shocking.
I know.
Shocking.
Wow.
We'll later find out that Robbins also had one. She wrote Sondheim a letter saying that the only regret she ever had was giving birth to him. And when she died in 92, Sondheim did not attend her funeral. He had been estranged from her for nearly 20 years. I think the first Sondheim musical that I saw was Into the Woods, and quite possibly the first Broadway musical I ever saw. I was also 8, like my dad, and it was in 1989, 88, which is kind of a dark choice because I remember being quite scared, yet also enthralled, as Into the Woods intertwines the plots of several Brothers Grimm fairy tales, exploring the consequences of the characters' wishes and quests.
He makes the first act basically all of the different fairy tale characters and their stories intertwining, and at the end of the first act they all get what they want, and then act 2 is about how what they want is literally destroying the entire world, and how are they going to deal with it or not, and it does not have a particularly happy ending.
It's very apocalyptic.
Yes.
Yeah. Sondheim was big on what I'm saying this from my perspective, I would say queering a mainstream capitalist understanding of myths and fairy tales, twisting audiences' expectations, and also writing some of the most complicated and impossible to perform lyrics and music to hit the Broadway stage, and truly turned Broadway into a more self-reflexive and like existential, like mirror, holding up the mirror moment for his audiences. So just... people say that he, quote, reinvented the American musical. He began his career by writing the lyrics for West Side Story in 1957. That was like his first big gig. And then following that, Gypsy in 1959, both of which Jerome Robbins choreographed and Arthur Lorenz worked on. He transitioned to writing both music and lyrics for the theater, with his best-known works including A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum in 1962, Company, my very favorite, in 1970, Follies in 1971, A Little Night Music 73, Sweeney Todd, The Demon Barber of Fleet Street 1979, Merrily We Roll Along 1981,
Other
Sunday
favorite.
in the Park of George, my other favorite 1984, Into the Woods 1987, Passion 1994, and his frequent collaborators consisted of Harold Prince and James Lapine, Leonard Bernstein, Arthur Lorenz, and known as the most, quote, hated man on Broadway, choreographer Jerome Robbins. So he won numerous awards for Academy Awards, Tony Awards, Grammy Awards, and he also won the Pulitzer. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a read on Stephen Sondheim from my perspective, even though it's not, quote, bad, gay, gossipy evilness, but he was in the closet through most of his life because, you know, he did come about in the U.S. during the 1950s and 60s during the Lavender Scare, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. And in my opinion, his work really reflected internalized homophobia and the gay panic of the times. Even later in life, when he came out and married his husband, who was 50 years younger than him, he refused to consider an all-male cast restaging of Company, for example, because he didn't want to admit that Bobby, the main character, a bachelor constantly being nagged by his married friends to get hitched, could be a metaphor for his own closeted lifestyle through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. His work dealt a lot with the frustrations of invisibility and heartbreak, and most specifically the hardships of being an artist in the wake of late capitalism, a theme that subtly and not so subtly was visible through many of his musicals. Specifically, my second most favorite musical, Sunday in the Park with George, which has a song called Putting It Together. I'm just going to read a quote from that song, which is, dot by dot, building up the image. Shot by shot, keeping it at a distance doesn't pay. Still, if you remember your objective, not give all your privacy away, a little bit of hype can be effective, as long as you can keep it in perspective. Even when you get some recognition, everything you do, you still audition. Art isn't easy. Overnight, you're a trend, you're the right combination, then the trend's at the end, you're suddenly last year's sensation. So this quote kind of explains a little bit what the musical is about, which is inspired by the main character named George, is inspired by the French pointillist painter Georges Seurat's painting A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of Le Grand Jean, painted in 1884 through 1886. The plot revolves around George, a fictionalized version of Seurat, who immerses himself deeply in painting his masterpiece, and his great grandson, also named George, in the second act, is a conflicted and cynical contemporary artist who is dealing with what that means to rise as an artist.
We probably now both have had the experience of first hearing those lyrics as teenagers and only now realizing how true they are.
I mean, when I complain about my frustrations of trying to be a professional artist, to this day, Stephen Rosenfeld always says to me, well, art isn't easy. Still.
Truly the greatest musical theater queen of all time.
So these are just a few readings on Sondheim's work, but from what I know, he was actually quite a sweet guy who really went out of his way to help young writers and performers succeed. So going back quickly once again to the biggest hetero Broadway queen, my dad, Steve Rosenfeld, I found out from him during all this research that, in fact, the first Broadway musical he ever saw when he was 8 was actually The King and I. He saw the original staging of The King and I.
Oh, boy.
Which hands down was one of the most racist Broadway shows ever made, next to West Side Story. So The King and I premiered in 1951, and it's a classic colonialist story about a 19th century British widow who travels to Siam, which is now Thailand, to tutor its monarch's many children, boasts familiar tunes, adorable child actors, and lavish production values. What The King and I was particularly regarded for was its choreographic hybrid of classical ballet and traditional, quote, Far Eastern dances. The choreographic style is ubiquitously described as the most pukey phrase of that period, East meets West.
I can just hear the, bad Hollywood movie Asia gong sounding as we...
Oof.
You know?
In fact, it was made into a Hollywood movie after the stage show.
Starring the emphatically not Thai, but extremely hot, it must be said, shirtless Yul Brynner as the king. Hello.
So, The King and I, choreographed by Jerome Robbins. So now we're getting into Mr. Robbins, who was known as a maniacal, egocentric, self-hating bitch. And as Stephen Sondheim once said, quote, the only genius I ever met, my definition of genius being endless invention. To repeat my earlier quote about Jerry from Wendy Lesser, the author of Jerome Robbins, A Life in Dance, quote, he may have been the most hated man on Broadway. He was famous for setting a certain kind of precedent in how the best of the best choreography was achieved, and I believe that he really set up the classic and still very prevalent role of the male choreographer as the genius who discovers and molds the dancer into his muse and then into his star. Having my own complicated connections to the contemporary dance world, the most obvious being that my partner is a contemporary dancer and I myself have worked with some choreographers as a performer, and like many of our colleagues, we've witnessed a few present-day Jerome Robbins types. Many of these choreographers wield power over their dancers, much like Robbins did with dancers and collaborators. I have a quote here from Jerry Robbins. I found the purpose of all I shall do, the regulation of my life. I will live to dance. That was 2 weeks after his 21st birthday. And he wrote it in his journal. Jerry Robbins kept journals from a very early age. Jerome Robbins was born as Jerome Wilson Rabinowitz on October 11th, 1918 on the Upper West Side of New York City.
Jerry Rabinowitz.
Like Stephen Sondheim. He grew up in a family of Russian Jewish immigrants who then eventually settled in Weehawken, New Jersey. His parents, Harry Rabinowitz and Lena Rips, owned a successful corset business, another Jewish garment family. Jerome Robbins had a complex and sometimes strained relationship with his mother.
Oh, don't say.
Lena Rips.
Don't say that Jerry Rabinowitz had a few choice words to say about Lena Rabinowitz.
Robbins grew up in a family that valued the arts and education.
Another shocker.
And also his sister Sonia was also a dancer who studied with Isadora Duncan, which is how he first got into dance. So he came from a family that had very high expectations of him, and this is thought to have contributed to his general sense of pressure, which Robbins often felt throughout his life, mostly feeling like he was never good enough and would never make anything good enough, hence his way of treating others around him. Apparently, when he acts out as a child, his mother would make a fake phone call to an orphanage and say, "Please come to take away my son. I don't want him."
Oh my God.
And this happened quite regularly, apparently.
Oy, oy, oy,
so it's really stuck with him for his life, and he often, used these kind of tactics with the people that he worked with to kind of get what he wants. So just some quick quotes from Jerry Robbins' journals. Sometimes the muse takes a long time to visit, and when she does, she doesn't bring what you expected. The struggle to create something new is a constant battle between the fear and exhilaration. Every dance begins with the terror of the blank page. I live in a world of self-doubt. The more I achieve, the more I question if I've done enough or if I'm any good at all. It's exhausting to be two people, the public artist and the private person who feels so deeply inadequate. The pursuit of perfection is both a curse and a blessing. It drives you to the limits of your abilities, but it also leaves you never satisfied with what you've accomplished. I am a difficult person to love. I expect too much, give too little, and always demand more than I offer. I fear that all I've done will be forgotten, that my dances will fade away like footprints in the sand. Legacy is a fragile thing. It's not the accolades or the applause that matter, but the lasting impact on the hearts and minds of those who see the work. He began his formal education at New York University, initially studying chemistry, but his passion for dance led him to drop out in 36 to pursue a career in the performing arts. In the neighborhood playhouse in New York City, he studied acting and modern dance, among other disciplines. He also trained at the New Dance League, which exposed him to a variety of dance styles and techniques. He made his professional stage debut performing in 1937 with the Yiddish Art Theater. Robbins' early experiences included a range of dance and theatrical performances, which helped him develop a versatile skill set that would become a hallmark of his career. He was in a few sort of small dance companies. I'm just sort of and where he then became quite influenced by expressionistic modern dance, where he worked specifically with a choreographer, Senia Sander, who then encouraged him to study ballet. In 1940, Robbins began performing in various dance companies, then joining the famed Ballet Theater, the first major American ballet company ever, which Jerry joined as a dancer and later became the American Ballet Theater, which he is considered to be the founding choreographer of, along with his mentor, George Blanchine. After Blanchine's death in 1983, he stayed on choreographing at the New York City Ballet until he officially retired in 1990. So I think there's something interesting about how he really committed his entire career to one company, essentially, the major years of his career.
Those works are still performed by the New York City Ballet all the time. I mean, they're really popular. They're really, in fact, the shows that he worked on that are revived, you probably are seeing choreography very much influenced by what he had put together, but new choreography made with new dancers. But the works at the New York City Ballet are being revived all the time.
Exactly.
And they're really in the core repertory of the works of that company.
And it was during the 50s where Robbins came to Broadway and brought his background in classical ballet and merged into a more popular contemporary dance theater. The thing that he's famous for is developing characters through movement, and he was really one of the first choreographers to tell complicated stories without having to use words. And that was something that is quite remarkable about his choreographic style, particularly for Broadway. Robbins joined the Communist Party in 1943, and at the time he was part of a circle of artists, intellectuals, and performers who were drawn to the post-Great Depression leftist ideologies, particularly during the early 1940s. This period saw many people in arts and entertainment attracted to communism due to its advocacy for social change, workers' rights, and opposition to fascism during World War II. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union remained communist, China was communist, and the USA lost the atomic bomb monopoly, and it looked as though the US was losing its domination. To investigate the perceived threat of communism infiltration, the House established the Committee on Un-American Activities, specifically communist activities after the Second World War, focusing their investigation specifically in the arts and sciences, starting with Hollywood.
And this was one of the most organized and successful campaigns of political repression in United States political history. I mean, if you want to know why leftist movements in the second half of the 20th century in the United States were often poorly organized, often lacked internal discipline, and often did not seem to have learned a lot of the lessons of earlier movements, one of the reasons is that an entire generation of leaders was cut off at the knees by this.
Absolutely. And what happened as a result is that a lot of comrades in arts, culture, and sciences were really torn apart, and in many cases turned their backs on each other, Jerome Robbins being one of them. And so in 1950, Ed Sullivan, who was one of the most popular TV talk show hosts, learned of Robbins' previous Communist Party ties and canceled Robbins' appearance on his weekly show. For 3 years, Sullivan and his friends at the FBI pressured Jerry to name his friends who were also in the party. Jerry resisted until he was subpoenaed and actually was threatened by Sullivan to be outed for his homosexual acts if he didn't comply. By 1953, Jerry Robbins was incredibly famous in Broadway world, in the ballet world. He had a huge, huge legacy already. He said, quote, "It was my homosexuality that I was afraid would be exposed." unquote, he wrote in his journal, "My career would be taken away. The facade of Jerry Robbins would be cracked open, and behind everyone would finally see Jerome Wilson Rabinowitz."
It's really funny, the internalized anti-Semitism alongside
huge.
the internal homophobia in that quote, right? Like the
Huge.
feared communist is also the Jew.
He
right?
did, in fact, I think it was Blanchine who suggested that he change his name when he started to become more professional and visible on the stage, from Rabinowitz to Robbins. In the early 1950s, a homophobic panic known as the Lavender Scare swept the country, and the fear of damage to his career was very realistic. People who refused to name names before the House committee had their careers ruined because they were blacklisted. Thousands of workers were driven from the federal workforce from the late 40s into the 60s because of their sexual orientation.
These are twinned scares, these lavender and red
Yes.
scares, and often, in both the arts and in federal employment, there were a lot of left-wing queer people, and in federal employment specifically because a lot of them had joined during Great Depression era artistic and social programs, which had been hotbeds of leftist ideology. And so there were just lots of people who had joined in that sense, and who were then sort of ripe to be rooted out in this new environment of the early 1950s.
So May 5th, 1953, Robbins appeared in front of the House and named 8 people who had been part of the Communist Party when he was part of the Communist Party. And I'm going to read their names because I think it's important to name the people whose lives got completely fucked up by Jerome Robbins. Madeline Lee Gilf and her husband, who were actors and activists. Lloyd Gauch, an actor. Elliot Sullivan, another actor. Edna Acco, a dance critic who had been a close friend of Robbins and had given him some favorable reviews. Letty Stever, who worked in the office of Robbins' agent Dick Dorso. Lionel Berman, a filmmaker. Edward Shodorov, Jerome's brother and a playwright.
He named his own brother?
He named his own brother, yeah. And also, yeah. So after testifying, Robbins, sitting on a sofa, said to playwright Arthur Lorenz, who we've mentioned before and who's that's where the orgy took place, who wrote the book of West Side Story. He said, "It'll be years before I know whether I did the right thing." Lorenz, his best friend, was much more certain and replied, "I can tell you right now, you were a shit, Jerry." Many years later, Robbins writes in his journal, "Maybe I will never find a satisfying release from the guilt of it all." And he did really carry it with him, apparently, and it kind of ate him from the inside through his whole career. While there were some who felt that Robbins was primarily motivated by ambition and informing the general consensus, it was really about his sexual orientation, that why he outed all of these people was to protect himself. And that was as we said, it was a real scare. A friend ironically said that one of the people that was outed said he had been stabbed by the wicked fairy. So, what were some of the alternatives he could have done rather than informing the government? He could have simply remained on Broadway as he had been doing. A number of blacklisted actors, writers, and directors were able to choose this route because theatrical funding was more diffuse than in Hollywood, but work in the theater was more sporadic and not as well paid as the movies. So if Robbins hoped to make it to Hollywood, which he did, and very triumphantly so, he had to save his own ass. And he was also aging out as a performer. This also brings me to the reality of the life of a dancer, which is at a certain point, your body is changing and you either have to adapt to that depending on what kind of dancer you are. But at that point, the concept of adaptation wasn't real, Who do you turn away from in your field? What is solidarity within the arts? That's, when people speak up, when people get defunded for their positions, who do you turn to as your comrades? Because I've seen people turn their backs, I've seen people go quiet, I've seen people show up for each other. And this story of him, being threatened with being outed in the 50s, therefore pushing him to turn his comrades in, is something that really somehow is very ghost-like to me today. So out of this whole scandal where Robbins lost a lot of friends and comrades, he still prevailed and went on to work on what is thought of as one of his major masterpieces, West Side Story, where he first met Stephen Sondheim. It's said to be the musical that changed the way Broadway musicals were made because of Robbins' choreographic tyrannical perfectionism. And he was told that the story of West Side Story threw movement and often wouldn't let any of his other collaborators into the studio.
West Side Story is about conflicting gangs of what at that point would have been called ethnic whites, non-WASP white people, and Puerto Rican people in what was then a working class neighborhood, which is now the Upper West Side of New York City. The area that West Side Story was set in was considered a slum and was actually demolished by federal slum clearance laws to build Lincoln Center, which is the temple of high culture at which the New York City Ballet has found its home in the spectacularly ugly New York State Theater designed by Bad Gays episode dedicatee Philip Johnson. If you think that building looks really Nazi, it's because he was. And Lincoln Center was a giant marble space alien that was basically placed on top of what had used to be a poor neighborhood. The people who lived there were all evicted, and Lincoln Center was basically designed so that you could drive in from the suburbs, park your car, emerge onto this beautiful plaza, go to your performance, go back downstairs and drive out and never have to walk down New York City street. And there's been some extensive work done in recent years to try to reconnect it a little bit to the streets of the city, but it still is very much not of the place that it is.
It's absolutely this sort of like spaceship feeling structure that landed in the middle of Manhattan. Okay, so a few controversial facts about West Side Story about both the stage and film, because I think this is one of the most known shows that Robbins and Sondheim worked on, and also films that Jerry worked on. Jerry was famously tough during rehearsals, pushing actors and dancers to their limits. For example, Robbins would sometimes separate the actors playing the Jets and the Sharks to build real tension between the groups, mirroring the rivalry depicted in the musical. He'd also use personal facts about them to turn against each other.
Oh, God.
He was awful. The film of West Side Story was a month late because Jerry couldn't make up his mind about the choreography and as a result was fired, but yet he still won an Academy Award for his work on that film. In 1961, West Side Story, the film, used brownface. The West Side Story brownface scandal is a contentious one when considering the history of West Side Story's 61 film. In order to help differentiate the members of the Jets and Sharks, the Puerto Rican characters are put in brownface in order to darken their complexion compared to the non-Puerto Rican characters. A very classic 1960s Hollywood racist, tactic.
Yeah.
Rita Moreno almost quit over the lyrics in the song America. To audiences wondering what is West Side Story about, it was a Romeo and Juliet inspired love story with the backdrop of 1950s American urban strife. What Rita Moreno, the star, did not want it to be was a racist depiction of Puerto Ricans, and she nearly quit over the lines to one of the songs in the film.
Yes, and that's a notable lyric change. It goes from Puerto Rico, you ugly island, island of tropic diseases, to Puerto Rico, you lovely island, island of tropical breezes. And the whole song is kind of rewritten in the movie to accommodate that lyric change, and the meaning of the song is rewritten in the movie, and the character's perspective on Puerto Rico is rewritten in the context of the movie, and the fact that Rita Moreno was able to make that happen is kind of amazing. It's a testament to her.
Absolutely, especially during that time. I like this fact. West Side Story was originally about a Catholic boy and a Jewish girl called East Side Story.
Oh my God, it would have what, Tony and Naomi?
Totally, Tony and Naomi.
Naomi, I just met a girl named Naomi.
I was like, okay, we don't need East Side Story.
And her mother.
And
Lena
her mother.
Rabinowitz.
Oh my Lord. Let's be grateful in a way it was not about that.
Really
it would have been about all
was.
the mommy issues that those boys had.
Mommy issues musical. So you mentioned earlier that Robbins brings this combination to Broadway of ballet technique and this kind of dance theater approach.
Yeah.
And I think West Side Story is a really good place to talk more about that, because I think people have a lot of visual images in their head of what the West Side Story dances look like.
Yes.
That motion is really iconic. So do you want to talk a little bit about those movements in that context and what you mean by that observation about the technique?
Well, as I understand, Robbins was somebody who did a lot of on-site research. So he actually went up to the areas where the quote-unquote gangs, Puerto Rican gangs of New York, were hanging out to observe them. In Fiddler on the Roof, which came after West Side Story, he went to Williamsburg. He spent a lot of time in the super religious Jewish part of Williamsburg and attended Orthodox and Hasidic weddings to understand traditional Jewish religious dance. It's weird to kind of think of those two back to back, but in fact they were made back to back.
So he did make East Side Story in his own way.
Totally. And
Far East Side Story, going all the way to Ukraine.
Who he met, who knows what boys were being brought home.
And so I think in people have these iconic images in West Side Story of these dances that are, on the one hand, extremely balletic and graceful, and on the other hand, have the theatrical impact of a gang fight.
Yeah.
And I think now, and I think one of the problems with the recent movie of West Side Story is that once this artifact leaves the late 1950s, the idea of singing and dancing urban gangsters becomes too silly. But at the time, this choreography is unbelievably raw and edgy and really conveys, using these very difficult formal dance techniques, the shapes and movement patterns of these working class urban gangsters.
And also, again, as fucked up in terms of race and immigration that West Side Story is, it also was the first Broadway musical, or one of the very first, that dealt with rape on stage, and also death, bloody death on stage. The fact that it came from a group of upper middle class gay white Jews is...
Well, who do you think directed and starred in our high school production, Liz?
Just to do a recap on Robbins' life, he created 54 ballets and choreographed or directed more than 20 Broadway shows, known for exploding expectations, again, of how classical and contemporary dance theater can be merged. Robbins was most famous for his vision of describing characters and telling stories through movement. He built characters with emotional arcs through choreographic language, which is why he was one of the masterminds behind what is called, once again, the Golden Age of Broadway. The other important legacy is about how he worked with people and became this archetype of the male hierarchical genius that created his dancers into muses, and the kind of power relationships in which he absolutely depended on in order to build a career. Some quotes from people who knew him, worked with him. He was a brilliant artist, but also a tyrant. He could be cruel and vindictive. Robbins had a reputation for being difficult, even vicious, in rehearsal rooms. His genius was matched only by his insecurity, which manifested in controlling behavior. For all his success, Robbins could be his own worst enemy, driven by self-doubt and a relentless pursuit of perfection. He demanded absolute precision and sometimes used fear as a motivator. His genius was never in question, but his treatment of people could be appalling. He was a perfectionist who could be merciless if he felt you weren't giving your all. He was the only director who ever made me cry. He was a really dreadful human being. Everybody hated him. Jerry had a split personality. He could be extremely charming and then suddenly become cold and dismissive. His demands were high. He expected everyone to be as committed as he was. There was a fearsome energy about him that pushed people to their limits. In her one-woman show, the comedian Beatrice Arthur, also known as Dorothy from the Golden Girls, recounted how one dancer had trained his Yorkshire Terrier accordingly. At cast parties, the door to the flat was left open, and at the point in the evening, the dancer would go to the doorway and look out and say, "Oh my God, here comes Jerry Robbins," and the little dog would fling himself against the door and slam it shut.
Okay, whichever gay guy thought to train his gay little dog that way is my new hero of the week.
Jerome Robbins was technically bisexual, but he also referred to himself as homosexual most of the time.
So that's why we're calling him gay, because he was one of these people who seems to have used relationships with women as a cover for homosexuality, which is not the case, of course, for all bisexual people. But in this case, as in the Freddie Mercury episode, he seems to have been someone who was fundamentally...
Jerome Robbins also used sexuality as a powerful tool over anybody. So, he fetishized his muses and manipulated them into the worst vulnerable and often beautiful performances. He did have relationships, as we just said, with both men and women. Some other people he had relationships included Montgomery Clift and many dancers, both male and female. There are accounts suggesting that his behavior towards dancers he worked with, and in some cases was intimate with, could be considered emotionally manipulative and psychologically challenging, which is not unheard of in power narratives between choreographer and dancer/performers even today. The idea of the muse is both manipulative and powerful, and sadly not an out-of-date power dynamic. And I really feel that he gave permission to choreographers that came after him, particularly male choreographers, and I would say to this day, female choreographers, to be emotionally manipulative, boundary-pushing, horrible people who claim to push your boundaries because they see that you have all of this talent. And it's something that...
And somehow all of this talent is going to be expressed by having sex with them. Isn't that amazing?
Or the threat of having sex.
Right.
This is also a big part of it, is that, I don't know if Jerome Robbins had sex with every muse of his, but the threat was always there that he could, and they would, if it was the right moment, they would, of course, say yes. That this kind of obsession with talent and beauty and perfection, you should feel honored to get that kind of attention. And this is still very much the economy of contemporary dance culture today. And it's something that I know I so naively am shocked by, but is absolutely what is pushing that, a big part of what's pushing that economy, and why so often independent dancers are afraid to, sort of quote unquote put up with the positions in which they're being put in, because to question the genius, to question the master, is to lose potentially your own power. Is it enough to just be a genius? How can we actually dismantle the concept of the muse, the concept of the genius, or rather, how can we shift it or expand it or change it? He had a lot of heart issues throughout the 80s, and he had a stroke in the 90s, but he continued to work. He also was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. He worked up until almost his death in 1998 at the age of 79. So I just want to end with a little anecdote. On November 23rd, 2021, I had the incredible opportunity to attend the revival of Company in New York City on Broadway, which is, again, my favorite Stephen Sondheim musical. It was my first trip to the States since the COVID-19 pandemic, and also my first time back at a live theatrical work. I cried while singing Ladies Who Lunch under my mask while I watched Patti LuPone on stage. Apparently the next day, Sondheim attended the matinee of Company, the same show that I had just been at a few days before, and then the next day he celebrated Thanksgiving with friends and died peacefully in his sleep. He was 91. No specific illness or cause of death was publicly disclosed beyond the description of it being a natural event, suggesting that it was just age and natural causes. And, really, this was the end of an era when he died. And so on the evening of the 26th, the evening that he died, after I had spent many hours sending voice recordings between my friends who love Sondheim as much as me, of us singing our favorite Sondheim songs.
I got one.
You did?
I loved that.
I decided to go to one of my old favorite haunts, Marie's Crisis, a piano bar in the heart of the West Village, which has been there since the 20s, where the everyday workers of Broadway go at the end of the night to have a drink and sing together. If you are caught looking at lyrics on your phone, you get thrown out. It's a serious joint for serious Broadway queens, like my dad, who I did bring there, and he went back on his own. Of course, the night of Sondheim's death, Marie's Crisis was mobbed, but I stood outside and listened to the crowd sing and remember and cry. I stood outside holding a single orchid, which was Sondheim's favorite flower. He spoke about orchids as often flowers with elegance and sophistication, qualities that can also be attributed to Sondheim's work in musical theater. His love for orchids reflects a similar attention to detail and an appreciation for beauty, both of which are evident in his intricate and thoughtful compositions and lyrics. The man standing next to me on the street said, "How did you know that's his fave?" I said, "Honestly, I Googled it." And he said, "Jerry Robbins loved orchids too." Who knew? So apparently Jerome Robbins had a particular fondness for orchids as well, and I found out orchids were his favorite flower.
Yay.
He often kept them around his home and in his workplace. His love for orchids was well known among his friends and colleagues, and they were a notable part of his personal aesthetic.
So thank you so much for telling that story and for preparing it so wonderfully for us and for our listeners. The first question I wanted to ask was a little bit more, or rather maybe the thing I wanted to talk about was to talk a little bit more about the aesthetic of Jerome Robbins' non-musical theater dance works. We talked a lot about the work that he did for musical theater and the way that in the three big musical theater works that you mention, the dance aesthetic is very much influenced by a kind of dance theater approach to using ballet technique to evoke a specific place, whether that's East meets West in The King and I, whether that's this sort of urban gang environment in West Side Story, or whether that's the shtetl in Vaill. There are very few ballets that take place in the shtetl. It's probably hard to do a piece called The Red Shoes That She Would Have Had If She'd Been Nicer to Her Mother. And so when Robbins is doing ballet works, what do they look like? What do they feel like?
I mean, I'm going to be honest with you. I am not so versed on Robbins' ballet choreography. However, I did see a lot of it as a child. He was very much committed to the traditions of ballet in terms of virtuosity and rigor, but he also was a choreographer that told stories through ballet choreography, which is something that had not been really seen so much in American ballet before.
Yeah, there's a simplicity to a lot of his work. Despite the fact that it's using these ballet techniques, you don't get a lot of frilly tutus and pose in the way that some classical ballet can be. And it's very, I remember a particularly lovely Jerome Robbins ballet of the Bach Goldberg variations.
Yes.
And seeing that there as a young man, actually crying during it. And it is very much a dance theater piece about the coming together of this community. And it's just very white stage and dancers in very, very simple colored outfits. And it's sort of so simple and perfect. And this idea of the orchid as his kind of aesthetic inspiration really makes a lot of sense after seeing that.
I think also the thing that Jerome Robbins did for both ballet and musical theater was that he made it a bit less about an intellectual and classes hierarchy. And he sort of, in particular with contemporary ballet, he opened it up more in terms of a people's art form, in the sense that it was on public television every Sunday. The New York City Ballet was the first ballet company to offer affordable tickets to people between young ages.
Yeah, it was founded at the same time as the New York City Opera, which was opera for the people, and this was ballet for the people, and the New York City Opera sadly has not survived. But the New York City Ballet did become the kind of predominant company in New York City. Yeah. And it's not a royal ballet company, right?
No.
The Berlin Opera Theater ballet companies originate from the Prussian Royal Ballet.
Yes.
And this was very much for the people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of the people, there's a kind of obvious, and you made an allusion to it when we were talking earlier. There's a really obvious, I think, at least to me, parallel between the moment in the arts that occurred in the early 1950s.
Yes.
And a moment that may be occurring in the arts now. I don't think we're quite there yet,
no.
But I think in some places we do start to see the clouds forming. And of course I'm talking about pressures around and the blacklisting of artists who engage in various kinds of Palestine solidarity work. We both live in Berlin, Germany, which is one of the epicenters of this. It is a place where there has been an attempt to, and there are ongoing attempts to make extremely controversial definitions of anti-Semitism, which classify many critiques of the state of Israel as de facto anti-Semitic conditions for receiving the state funding that many artists depend on, and many people have been disinvited, banned, not allowed to appear on stages,
fired,
and many other people have been scared into silence by this campaign. And another thing that I think really characterizes both of these campaigns is that there is a degree to which a certain kind of well-meaning left liberalism can be scared of certain versions of the expression, of the political expression that is being banned, in a way that makes them move away from their general, I think, real commitment to intellectual and artistic freedom and towards collaboration, right? Like in the early 1950s, you have, I think, the threat of Stalin, right? And the kind of what it really pushes a lot of people in that direction, right? And then I think right now, there are a lot of people in Germany, a lot of Germans in Germany who are, I think, in addition to being thrilled that they are now able to take the moral high ground while also being racist, are also many of them, I think, genuinely extremely terrified to confront and sorry for what their grandparents did, and are really eager to take a simple answer that points them to like the good thing, the right thing to do now to make amends, right?
Yes.
So I don't know. I can't be the only that comparison has to have come to your mind as well. I mean, we're both lefty and more pro-Palestine queer Jews living in Berlin. We both know a lot of people who've been blacklisted. I have my own complicated history of work with German institutions. I'm lucky enough that I don't make most of my money from them, but you do. Does this analogy feel crazy to you right now?
No. I also want to just go ahead and say that I come from Holocaust surviving German Jews who left Germany in different capacities, ended up in Palestine, and explicitly left Palestine just as Israel was establishing because of their feelings regarding fascism. And that was something that they were very explicit about.
In other words, they would have stayed in Palestine had it become a binational state.
Exactly.
But left when the ethno-national state was founded.
Exactly.
Right.
And took my mother with them, who was born in Jerusalem in the 40s, late 40s. And so, I have a very particular connection to this, which is, hard to be here with, particularly with the politics in which I was raised with. I lived and was raised by those people who were very much about Jewishness as social justice, as something that is coming from a human rights position, and in many ways embraced arts and culture as part of that discussion in our lives. So for me, my love of Broadway, for all of its flaws, because anything that is created under a system, whether it's art, culture, sciences, etc., that all has really fucked up roots in many ways.
I mean, I'm an opera queen. You don't need to tell me. Literally all of my favorite. There's someone very funnily said that for Puccini, there's only two kinds of women: Miss Piggy or dead.
There you go.
Exactly.
God.
Sometimes they start out as Miss Piggy and then die. That's Tosca, basically. But
pretty much, yeah. My mother was the opera queen of our house, so that's another episode. But basically, I was really influenced by all of this as an artist myself, and also as a sort of, dream to be on Broadway performer who became a experimental performance artist. But that's another kind of choice I'm not sure could have made differently. But but yeah, I mean, I do really see, when I was really going deep into Robbins and the whole McCarthy era, especially because so many references to McCarthyism have been made very explicitly in the last year, almost year here in Germany and beyond, in arts, culture, and sciences. I should say it's not just visual and performative performance arts. It's also academia. It's sciences. It's really the things that we depend on to expand and give us perspective on culture, which is, yes, in many ways bourgeois, but also very much has a deep labor and like working class roots as well, which is important to state here because a lot of people feel that it's a bourgeois fight to fight for freedom of speech in the arts.
It's certainly not when those arts are, as they are in Germany, publicly funded, and when actually one of the things about the arts in Germany...
Not for long!
Well, no, I mean, they will continue to be publicly funded, but what will be publicly funded will be people who look like they're in the Hitler Youth, shirtless, dropping cars on things.
I hope that's not the case. I really do. And I do want to say on an up note, we both come from a country that never really had proper public funding for the arts. And, in my days, I was trained to understand that the only way forward as an artist was to become a brand that was privately funded by some rich foundation or something. And, moving to Europe nearly 20 years ago, between lots of different places, I really learned from, or actually in my early 20s, even spending time in the UK, I really learned from an arts community that artists are working laborers from lots of different class backgrounds. And yes, there is a reality that many artists who make it into the upper echelon of the art world are coming from upper middle class backgrounds because they don't have to worry about how they're going to make money and they can spend all their time focusing on how to brand themselves.
And in a less cynical way, you just have more time, in addition to knowing the kind of class dynamics and being more likely to know and understand how to interact with the people who are likely to be decision makers in the field. You also just have more time to do the thing if you don't have to have another job.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I will just go ahead and say, I do come from an upper middle class background, and that absolutely enabled me to end up to make my life abroad in a way that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. But I also met so many different kinds of artists who have devoted their working lives and everyday lives to being artists in so many different ways. And, and what is remarkable about a public funding structure is that it recognizes that a working artist is a worker, is a legitimate laborer, is somebody contributing to the ideas and the fabric of society and the importance of that. And so I just, with that, going through, the ways in which Robbins, what he had to go, or what he, I would say, chose / felt he had to go through to what ends to keep his power and his, it's one thing to stay in the closet. It's another thing to throw your comrades under the bus, And I'm not saying that's happening right now specifically, but it is happening in sort of like neo momentary ways now to people who are around us and connected to our networks and community.
Yeah, people are not necessarily being asked to name names, but people who work at these institutions are definitely being asked to monitor people, are definitely being asked to not invite people, are definitely being asked to enforce both formal and informal policies of exclusion. And they're being threatened, just as they were in the McCarthy era, with very real things. Being threatened with loss of jobs. Being threatened if they speak out with potential permanent loss of income in some fields. There are many fields where a working artist cannot be a working artist if they do not receive public funding. For example, experimental theater and performance. There just are not collectors who buy experimental theater works in the way that there are collectors who buy paintings and drawings. Although even in the commercial world, there are a lot of pressures. And I've heard many stories from people about, being threatened potentially with loss of their markets for saying or writing certain things. So.
Absolutely. And so what this sort of story of Jerome Robbins really made me think a lot about is, how from the kind of the McCarthy period to just kind of his general accepted, behavior as this sexist, power-hungry tyrant of contemporary dance and ballet. I just, what I'm always trying to ask myself as an artist is, what is my responsibility in this space? And how can I, in my small ways, open space for others and support other artists to see different kinds of futures and ways in which we can work and survive in both visual and performance practices. So, for me, that's actually kind of very much at the crux of my work as an artist, is making the things, but also thinking about how they're seen and how they're encountered, and also what kind of openings come from those in order for others to slip through those and also claim that space. And I really hope for those listening that might have more, privilege, power, space. I know that you probably feel worried that it could slip away from you at any moment, but as someone said to me yesterday, those who ask themselves what they're willing and able to lose are not usually the ones that are in positions of privilege and power.
I can't think of a better place to end the episode than that. For those who would like to learn more about Jerome Robbins, we have a full source list of the work that Liz used to put that episode together in the source notes, as always. So that's our show for today. Thank you so much for once again tuning in. Please keep your ears peeled for another very exciting upcoming special episode, and for our next full season, which we can announce will be debuting this fall. So enjoy that, and until then, bye!
Bye!